Even after implementing all the other amazing techniques so far, your blood sugar is not always going to be perfect. It still might get a little too high sometimes, it still might get a little too low sometimes, and that's okay. Now we're going to talk about how to correct those highs and lows without going overboard, without going too low, and without going too high. Once again, it's all about experimenting. To not go overboard, you need to figure out just that right amount, and it might be different for you than it is for someone else. Get comfortable with tinkering your correction factors. Get comfortable tinkering how much sugar you take in order to find exactly what you need to bring you back to the better range, 80 to 100, and keep you at a safe number. Let's start with high blood sugar, which I define as anything above 120. Because once you go past 120, you start getting into the range where science has shown damage occurring from high blood sugar levels. So you want to keep it below 120. When it goes above there, I take a correction. And your correction factor depends on you. For me, 1 unit of human log will affect me by about 30 units, but again, it may be very different for you. Whatever your correction factor already is, start there. But remember to not be afraid to tinker your numbers if that correction factor is not working, because your insulin needs change from day to day. Your insulin sensitivity changes from day to day, and that correction factor might change. To figure out if your correction factor is right, what you should do is when your blood sugar gets too high, take whatever amount you think you need. Write that down. Write down the blood sugar, write down how much you took, or at least remember it. And then keep checking your blood sugar at least every hour to see what happens. Now, don't assume that your insulin's already done working after just an hour, even if it's a very fast acting insulin. Because for some insulin, such as Humalog, I noticed that it affects me up to 2 hours after I take it. If I tested it in an hour and it was still too high, so I'd say I take more, I'd end up going low. So don't jump the gun. Look into how fast your fast acting insulin is and how long it's in effect. You can find that information on Google very easily. Test those numbers and log what happens. If your blood sugar ends up at just the right range, perfect. Remember how long it took. If it goes too high, if it goes too low, perfect. Keep that in mind and tinker your correction factor appropriately for next time. Now, what insulin you use is really up to you, but I would highly recommend using a faster acting insulin rather than something like R, which is best for meals, because faster acting insulin means your blood sugar is not going to be as high for as long. And that's what you want. You want it to be high for the least amount of time possible. And keep in mind, context is key. If you just ate a ton of food, for example, there's a lot of protein running through your system, and it's still raising your blood sugar, then the correction you take might not be as effective as you'd think. Likewise, if you just took some insulin and your blood sugar's a little bit high, you take some more insulin, you might notice it drops way too low because the insulin that you just took is still in effect. Keep the context of what you ate and what insulin you've taken in mind before you go about making your correction. And it seems that for many people, including me, it's not just the same correction factor at 250 as it is at 120. I noticed that when my blood sugar is higher, it takes maybe a little bit more insulin than it should compared to when my blood sugar is lower. So keep that in mind when you do your calculations. That might be the case for you, but it's just something to consider. Even when it comes to slightly high blood sugar, like let's say you're at 125, I still think it's worth correcting because really the ideal blood sugar is between 80 to 120. Just correct a little bit, microdose. Don't be afraid to take just half a unit or 1 unit at a time if that's what you need to bring yourself back down. That's the point of tinkering, experimenting, logging, and seeing how much that correction affects you. So that way you can be comfortable with taking a small correction and knowing exactly where it's going to bring you. Now let's talk about lows. Your doctor might have recommended correcting a low with the 15-15 rule. Take 15 grams of sugar every 15 minutes or test every 15 minutes until it's back up. Problem with this is that oftentimes this is missing the mark. You may notice when you do this that your blood sugar ends up too high and you need to correct it to bring it back down again. That's no good because you're going to risk going low again and you're going to be on this roller coaster. Instead of overshooting it, what you need to understand is that sugar affects people differently. For me, if I took 15 grams of sugar and then waited 15 minutes, my blood sugar would end up way too high. It only takes me about 4 grams to get from 60 to 90. If I took 15, it would be much higher than that, and that'd be a big problem for me. How much sugar affects you is going to vary, and it actually might change once you go on a low carb approach. So you want to keep that in mind. When you correct a low blood sugar, start with what you already know is best, but test your blood sugar frequently after, just like you do with correcting a high, and see how high it gets you. And if it gets you too high, take less next time. If it doesn't do enough, take a little bit more next time until you get it right. I also recommend when you do a correction, again, because we're talking about experiments here, you want to limit as many variables as possible. So when you do a correction, you need something consistent, reliable, and something you're not going to overdo. I don't recommend you correct with any snack you have lying around the house or any candy, no chips, no chocolate. If you do that, not only is it going to be variable, but it's going to be very tempting to overdo. And you might eat the whole bag and your blood sugar is going to be super high later. You're going to be like, oh no, you don't want that. Instead, what I recommend is to treat correcting your low blood sugar more like medicine than like a treat. And the best way to do that is with glucose tabs or Smarties, which are basically glucose tabs but smaller. The good thing about glucose tabs is that they're very precise. They're meant to be exactly 4 grams a tablet. You know exactly what you're getting, and so you'll be able to learn from one correction to the next what works and what doesn't. And they're not very tempting. They're not very tasty. They kind of taste like chalk, especially the grape ones. They're just not very good. So you're not going to be very tempted to overeat them, which is going to be very important to not overshooting and not ending up too high, just to make another correction and too low. What you want is to get your blood sugar from whatever low is up to 80 to 100 and not higher. And you can do that with the help of glucose tabs and Smarties. Another thing I like to say about correcting low blood sugar is that I don't agree with the 15-minute part either. For me, I've noticed just by feeling and just by testing myself, it takes about 30 minutes for sugar to get all the way through my system. If I took my 4 grams of carbs to get my blood sugar from 60 to 90, and I test it again 15 minutes later, it might still be 65, and I take more sugar and then end up at 120. If I instead waited 30 minutes, which is what I do now, test it again, it would be exactly where I want it to be. Again, another thing to keep in mind, you might be better off waiting 30 minutes rather than 15. Don't assume that the sugar is already done working through your system so quickly. And again, keep context in mind. Let's say your blood sugar is not quite low yet. Let's say it's 75, but you feel like you're dropping and you just took some insulin. Well, that should tell you that maybe you should preemptively eat some sugar just in case. Because of that context, so you know that insulin's affecting you, it's bringing your blood sugar down, and you want to avoid having that low blood sugar. So don't be afraid to preemptively fix a mistake if you're aware of the context and you know that you're going to be preventing something by doing that. Of course, what I recommend, just like what I recommend with anything else, is to tinker it, take it slow, and learn from your previous mistakes until you figure out exactly what correction factor works and how much glucose you need to bring you back up. Ideally, you want to know exactly how much gram affects you, so that way you can calculate how much grams you need of sugar to bring you back up from wherever your low is to wherever you want to be. That's really all there is to it. Experiment, tinker, experiment again until you know exactly what dose you need for what situation. Doing this, you'll be able to find just the dose you need or just the amount of sugar you need to get your blood sugar just right. Not too high and not too low. And once you do that, you're going to be finding it much easier to tame your blood sugar and tame type 1 and get off that blood sugar roller coaster. Remember, small numbers means small mistakes. Same with corrections. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.